The Winchester Mystery House loomed before the team like a gothic nightmare, its jagged rooflines cutting into the darkened sky. Caleb Porter, the lead investigator, felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he stepped out of the government-issued SUV, staring at the mansion's eerie, mismatched windows. Behind him, his team shuffled with nervous energy, each member already feeling the weight of the mission. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Nate, the tech specialist, his hands already gripping the EMF meter tightly. "And we haven't even gone inside yet." As the team approached the towering front doors, a cold gust of wind swept through the air, carrying with it the distinct smell of decay, as if the house itself was rotting from the inside. Caleb's fingers brushed the door's brass handle. Without warning, it creaked open by itself, revealing a darkened entry hall. His heart thumped heavily in his chest as the shadows swallowed them. They stepped inside cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The mansion's infamous oddities were already on full display. Staircases leading into the ceiling, doors that opened into walls, and narrow hallways that twisted and turned in impossible directions. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them. The air grew heavier as they ventured deeper, the silence punctuated only by the soft creak of old floorboards. Caleb could feel something, an oppressive presence lurking just out of sight. "Stay close," he ordered. "This place is built to disorient. If you lose track of where you are, you might never find your way back." They split up into pairs, Nate and Lisa taking the west wing, while Caleb and Brianna ventured towards the mansion's infamous seance room. Every step they took felt wrong, as though the house itself was shifting beneath their feet. As they entered the seance room, an icy chill filled the air, prickling Caleb's skin. The circular table in the center of the room was covered in dust, but the chairs looked as if they'd been recently moved. Brianna scanned the area with her thermal camera, but the readings were off the charts, far too erratic for a simple ghost sighting. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "There's something here with us." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Caleb whirled around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room's shadows seemed to thicken, crawling along the walls like living things. Then came the whispers. At first, they were barely audible, like voices just out of reach, but they grew louder, more insistent. They were speaking in a language Caleb couldn't understand, a guttural sound that made his stomach churn. Brianna's breath hitched beside him as her flashlight flickered. The shadows in the room elongated, stretching toward them with unnatural intent. Out of the corner of his eye, Caleb saw it, a figure tall and slender, watching them from the far corner of the room. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply stared. "Run!" Caleb whispered, grabbing Brianna's arm. They bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the twisted hallways. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, and the walls themselves felt as though they were shifting, closing in on them. But no matter how fast they ran, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, something ancient and malevolent. As they rounded a corner, they nearly collided with Nate and Lisa, who were wide-eyed and pale. "We need to get out of here," Nate panted. "There's something in this house." Caleb nodded, already knowing what he meant. But as they turned to leave, they realized with horror that the door they had entered through was gone, replaced by another hallway that hadn't been there before. The house had trapped them. The weight of the mansion seemed to press down on them, the walls narrowing, suffocating. Caleb's pulse raced as the reality of their situation sank in. The Winchester Mystery House wasn't just a haunted location. It was alive, shifting its structure to trap its prey. They weren't investigating it anymore. They were prisoners. "Where the hell is the door?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Caleb muttered, "but we can't panic. We need to find another way out." Nate, his face pale, clutched his equipment like a lifeline. "This place, it's warping. My gear's going haywire. It's like the house itself is screwing with us." Suddenly, a soft groan echoed through the hall. The group froze, flashlights flickering erratically as the groan morphed into something far more sinister, a guttural snarl, inhuman and wet. It reverberated off the walls, disorienting them further. "What the hell was that?" Brianna whispered, taking a cautious step back. Before anyone could answer, the hallway ahead of them twisted and warped. A figure, no, several figures, emerged from the shadows. Crawlers. Their bodies were twisted and malformed, limbs unnaturally long as they skittered toward the group like insects on the walls and ceiling. Move. Go. Caleb barked, shoving the others forward. The team broke into a sprint, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Behind them, the sound of claws scraping against wood grew louder as the crawlers gave chase. Lisa tripped, and before Caleb could help her, one of the creatures pounced, dragging her into the shadows. Her scream was cut short, leaving only a deafening silence in its wake. "Lisa!" Brianna cried, but Caleb yanked her forward, forcing her to keep moving. They barreled into a room, slamming the door shut behind them. The old wood groaned under the pressure of the crawlers clawing at it, but it held, for now. Panting, they backed away from the door, their eyes wide with terror. They took her," Brianna whispered, shaking. "We couldn't save her." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. Nate knelt down, his hands trembling as he checked his equipment. "This isn't right. None of it makes sense. The readings are all over the place. It's like this place is warping reality." The room they were in was no less unsettling. An old parlor with dust-covered furniture and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in a century. But something felt off. Caleb's gaze was drawn to the mirror above the fireplace, where a faint reflection flickered. But it wasn't their reflection. A shadowman stood in the mirror, its featureless face staring back at them. Slowly, it raised one long, skeletal finger, pointing directly at Caleb. "We need to get out of here," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible. But as Caleb turned to the door, a sickening realization hit him. The crawlers had gone silent. Too silent. Whatever was hunting them had just begun. The silence was deafening. Caleb, Brianna, and Nate stood frozen in the parlor, the shadowman's image still lingering in the mirror. The tension in the room was unbearable, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Caleb stepped forward, his eyes locked on the mirror. The shadowman had vanished, but a lingering darkness seemed to seep from the reflection, bleeding into the room. "We can't stay here," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Nate, still shaking from the crawler attack, gripped his EMF meter, eyes darting nervously around the room. "I don't think we have a choice. The house is alive, man. It's playing with us." "Not if we get out," Brianna muttered, scanning the walls for any exit that might lead them to safety. But as they turned to leave, something unnatural happened. The door they had come through disappeared before their eyes, swallowed by the shifting architecture of the house. In its place stood a blank wall, like the door had never existed. Brianna gasped. What the hell? The house is trapping us," Caleb said through gritted teeth, trying to suppress the growing panic. He approached the far wall, running his hands over the surface, as if searching for hidden seams or escape routes. Nothing. A soft shuffling noise caught their attention. All three of them spun around to face the mirror, now completely blackened. A strange mist began to swirl inside it, growing thicker, as if the mirror was transforming into a portal. Suddenly, the mist burst from the glass, flooding the room. Caleb felt a sudden cold grip his chest. "Go now!" he shouted, pushing Brianna and Nate toward a side door that had appeared on the far side of the parlor. They burst through it into a narrow, dimly lit hallway, only to realize that this wasn't part of the original layout. The house had changed again. The hallway stretched on forever, its walls lined with cracked and peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Blood? Caleb's stomach churned as the oppressive atmosphere closed in around them. "There's no end to this," Nate muttered, his voice breaking. "We're going to die here." Brianna placed a firm hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him. "We keep moving. No matter what happens, we keep moving." As they ventured further down the hall, Caleb's mind raced. The Winchester house was rumored to have been built to confuse spirits, but now it was clear that the house was manipulating more than just the dead. It was alive, feeding on their fear, toying with their sense of reality. Then, ahead of them, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Someone or something was approaching. Caleb raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim haze. His heart sank as he saw the silhouette of a woman, standing perfectly still at the end of the hallway, her back turned to them. "Hello," Caleb called, his voice trembling slightly. The woman didn't move. Brianna and Nate tensed beside him, their breaths shallow. The woman's figure was bathed in shadows, her dress ragged and torn. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned her head toward them. Her face was not human. The skin was pale and stretched tight across her bones, her eyes hollow and black. A jagged, unnatural smile cut across her face. Without a sound, she began to float toward them, her feet hovering inches off the ground. "Run," Caleb whispered, but his body was frozen in place. The woman's grin widened, and her hollow eyes locked onto his, pulling him in with an unnatural force. But before she could reach him, Brianna grabbed Caleb's arm, yanking him back into motion. They bolted down the hall, the sound of the woman's raspy laughter echoing behind them, getting closer. The hall twisted and turned, offering no clear path, no escape. They were trapped in the belly of a nightmare, and the house wasn't about to let them go. The hallway warped again, twisting into a sickening spiral as the three of them fled the apparition. Caleb could hear the woman's sinister laughter growing fainter, but his instincts screamed at him to keep moving. The house was a labyrinth of horrors, and one wrong turn could mean their end. Finally, they burst through a door and into what seemed to be an old dining room. A massive, dust-covered chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the warped wooden floor. The long dining table, set for a meal that never came, stretched out before them, covered in cobwebs. "This place," Brianna whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not just haunted, it's cursed." Before Caleb could respond, the floor beneath Nate gave way with a sickening crack. He yelped, plunging into the darkness below. Caleb and Brianna rushed to the edge of the gaping hole, peering down into the black void. "Nate!" Caleb shouted, his voice echoing down into the darkness. "Are you okay?" For a moment there was silence. Then, a groan of pain rose up from the void. I'm alive," Nate's voice called weakly. "But I think I broke my leg. There's something down here." The panic in Nate's voice was palpable. Caleb's heart pounded as he pulled a flashlight from his belt, aiming it into the hole. The beam illuminated a dark, damp basement, rotting beams and crumbling stone walls barely visible in the gloom. And then Caleb saw it. Something was moving down there, slithering, crawling. Nate's flashlight flickered, casting frantic shadows on the walls. Dark, twisted shapes darted in and out of the light. "Crawlers! Get out of there!" Caleb shouted, but Nate's scream cut through the air. A sickening sound of flesh tearing filled the room, followed by the gurgling of Nate's voice being silenced. Brianna clapped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as they heard the unmistakable sound of something dragging Nate's body away. Caleb recoiled in horror. "We have to move," he muttered, his voice cracking. He grabbed Brianna by the arm and led her away from the hole, back into the chaos of the Winchester house. But as they made their way into yet another twisting corridor, the distant echoes of Nate's final moments haunted them, reminding them that the house had claimed another victim. They were running out of time, and the house wasn't done with them yet. Caleb and Brianna rushed through the twisting halls of the Winchester Mystery House, their footsteps echoing in the endless corridors. Nate's horrific death lingered in their minds, his screams still etched into their ears. Every door they passed seemed to creak and moan, as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Brianna stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her face pale and tense. Caleb paused, his breath ragged. At first, all he could hear was the sound of his own heart pounding. But then, faintly, from the walls themselves came a low, insistent whispering. The voices sounded like they were all around them, overlapping, murmuring indistinct words in a language neither of them could understand. "It's the shadows," Brianna said, her voice trembling. "They're talking." Caleb stared at the dark corners of the hall, where shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in ways that defied logic. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "We have to keep moving." But the moment they turned the corner, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The walls began to stretch and warp, bending toward them like the house itself was closing in. The shadows on the floor elongated, reaching for their feet like ghostly hands, trying to drag them into the darkness. Brianna screamed, stumbling backward. The floor beneath her cracked, and long, jagged fractures spread across the wooden boards. Caleb grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety just as a gaping hole opened beneath them. From the darkness below, something slithered. A cold, wet sound like flesh scraping against stone echoed up, and Caleb felt his blood turn to ice. Crawlers! Run! He shouted, yanking Brianna down another hall. The shadows were growing thicker now, swirling and coiling like living creatures, and the whispers were deafening, like 1,000 voices speaking all at once. They stumbled into a room lined with dusty old mirrors. Each mirror reflected distorted versions of themselves, twisted and warped like grotesque funhouse images. Caleb's reflection stared back at him with hollow eyes, its mouth slowly curling into a wicked grin. "We're not alone," Brianna whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were fixed on one of the mirrors, where something dark and monstrous moved just behind their reflections. Caleb stepped closer to the glass, his skin crawling as he realized what he was seeing. In the reflection, a tall, shadowy figure loomed behind them. A shadowman, its long arms outstretched, reaching for them. But when he spun around, the room was empty. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, rattling the mirrors. The shadowman was getting closer. Caleb could feel it. "We need to get out of here," he said, panic rising in his throat. He grabbed Brianna's hand and ran toward the door. But as they reached it, the mirrors began to shatter, one by one. Glass rained down around them, and the air filled with the sound of distant laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman. Brianna stumbled, falling to the ground, her hands cut and bleeding from the shards of glass. Caleb pulled her to her feet, his heart racing, but the door wouldn't budge. They were trapped. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its face featureless but somehow radiating pure malice. The Shadowman had come. The room closed in around them as the Shadowman advanced. Caleb's breath hitched, his hand gripping Brianna's tightly. The air felt thick, like trying to breathe through water. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house had them. The Shadowman's long, skeletal fingers grazed the walls, leaving streaks of darkness that seemed to crawl across the surface like ink. Its form shifted and flickered, never fully materializing, always just out of reach, like a nightmare that refused to solidify. Suddenly, a loud banging noise echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sounds of chaos. Voices, panicked shouts, and the unmistakable wail of paramedics. A rescue team had finally arrived. "Over here," Brianna shouted, her voice cracking as she banged on the door. Caleb joined her, pounding his fists against the wood. The commotion outside grew louder, more frantic, but still, the door remained sealed. The Shadowman was just feet away now, its presence sucking the warmth from the room. Caleb could feel the temperature plummet as his breath fogged in the freezing air. Then, just as he thought it was over, the door exploded open with a loud crash, and two figures in tactical gear burst through, weapons drawn. "Get down!" one of them shouted. Without hesitation, Caleb and Brianna dropped to the floor as the rescue team opened fire on the Shadowman. The bullets passed straight through it. The Shadowman laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent chills down Caleb's spine. It advanced on the team, who backed away in terror as they realized their weapons were useless. The figure reached out, and with a single swipe of its clawed hand, one of the rescuers was thrown against the wall with bone-crushing force. "Fall back!" shouted the remaining team member, grabbing Caleb and Brianna by the arms and pulling them to their feet. "This thing isn't human." They stumbled into the hallway, barely making it past the door before it slammed shut behind them, sealing the Shadowman inside. The house groaned, its walls shifting again, trapping the fallen rescuer inside with the entity. "Where's the rest of your team?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. "Gone," the rescuer said, his face pale with fear. "We lost contact with half of them as soon as we stepped inside. This place it's not right." Brianna clutched her bleeding hand, wincing in pain. "We need to get out of here before it comes after us again." But as they hurried down the hall, the walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. Doors appeared where there had been none before, and corridors that should have led to safety only led them deeper into the labyrinth. They reached a large, abandoned room that looked like it had once been an asylum. Rusted metal beds lined the walls, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. Brianna's breath caught as she noticed writing on the walls, scrawled in dark, dripping ink. "You'll never leave. None of you." Suddenly, the beds began to rattle, shaking violently as a cold wind howled through the room. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in their minds, filling them with dread. And then, from the shadows, crawlers emerged, their twisted bodies contorting unnaturally as they crawled toward the group, their eyes glowing with hunger. There was nowhere left to run. The crawlers moved with unnerving speed, their limbs clicking as they scuttled over the decaying floorboards like grotesque insects. Their bodies were unnaturally thin, gaunt faces stretched over skeletal frames, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They made no sound beyond the scratching of claws against wood and the occasional rasp of breath, animalistic and hungry. Caleb barely had time to register their approach before one of them lunged at him, its mouth wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. He threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. The crawler hit the floor hard, but before Caleb could even recover, it twisted its body impossibly, snapping itself upright again. "Get back!" the remaining rescue team member shouted, drawing a flare gun from his belt. He fired, and the room was bathed in sudden, harsh red light. The flare landed in the middle of the room, illuminating the crawlers in ghastly detail. Their skin was mottled and gray, patches of it peeling away to reveal black, pulsing veins beneath. The light seemed to agitate them. One screeched, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the asylum's crumbling walls. Another leaped toward Brianna, who was frozen in place, terror etched on her face. Caleb acted on instinct, grabbing a broken bed frame and swinging it wildly. The metal collided with the crawler midair, sending it crashing into one of the rusty beds with a loud clatter. It let out an inhuman snarl, writhing on the floor, but there were more behind it, crawling out of the shadows. "They just keep coming," Caleb shouted, his voice strained with panic. The rescue team member fired another flare, the light driving the creatures back momentarily. But the reprieve was short-lived. The shadows in the room seemed to warp and shift, as if the house itself was feeding the crawler's strength. The whispers, too, grew louder, chanting in a language Caleb couldn't understand, filling the room with a growing sense of doom. "We need to get out of here," Brianna gasped, pulling at Caleb's arm. Her hands were shaking, blood still dripping from the cuts on her palms. "There's no way out," Caleb yelled back, his voice cracking with fear. The rescue team member, now visibly shaken, fumbled with his radio. "HQ, we need immediate extraction. This place is... It's..." Before he could finish, one of the crawlers tackled him from behind, dragging him to the ground. His screams were cut short as the creature tore into him, blood spraying across the floor. Brianna shrieked, backing away into a corner as another crawler closed in on her. Caleb grabbed a metal rod from the debris and swung it with all his strength, striking the creature in the skull. The impact crushed the crawler's head with a sickening crunch, and it fell to the ground, twitching. But it wasn't enough. More crawlers were coming, their glowing eyes now fixated on the remaining survivors. "We can't stay here," Caleb whispered, his voice hollow. "We'll die if we don't move." Brianna nodded, her face pale. Together, they made a run for the far side of the room. But just as they reached the door, it slammed shut on its own, locking them in. Behind them, the crawlers were advancing again, faster this time, as if they knew their prey was cornered. And then, from the far end of the room, another door creaked open, a door they hadn't noticed before. Beyond it was a stairwell, leading down into the basement. Without hesitation, they ran for it, plunging into the darkness below. The stairs spiraled downward, the air growing colder with every step. The faint glow from the flare in the room above disappeared entirely, leaving them in pitch blackness. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the distant, eerie whispers that still echoed from the upper floors. Caleb flicked on his flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the oppressive dark. The basement walls were slick with moisture, old pipes running along the ceiling, dripping water that sounded deafening in the silence. "This place just keeps getting worse," Brianna muttered, her voice barely more than a breath. The basement felt different, heavier, as though the very air was pressing down on them. The whispers here were deeper, more guttural. And then, from somewhere in the distance, they heard something dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate. "What is that?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. They turned a corner, and the basement opened up into a vast, underground chamber. Old, rusted hospital beds were strewn about, some with chains still attached to the frames. The walls were covered in faded symbols, ritualistic markings that sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. In the center of the room stood a large, circular iron door, bolted shut with thick chains. Something about the door made Caleb's stomach turn. It felt wrong, as if whatever was behind it was ancient and angry. Before they could investigate, the dragging sound grew louder. From the far corner of the room, a figure emerged, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. A shadowman. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its hollow gaze fixed on them. Caleb froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The air grew colder, and his breath fogged in front of him. "We have to get out of here," Brianna whispered, backing away toward the stairwell. But the shadowman raised its hand, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped. The whispering intensified, now loud and aggressive, as if the voices were urging the shadowman forward. It floated toward them, its form shifting in the darkness, a twisted mass of blackness and malice. Caleb reached for the iron door, trying to pull the chains free, but they wouldn't budge. Whatever was behind the door was locked for a reason, but now it felt like their only escape. "We need to open it," Caleb said, his voice shaky. What if we let something worse out?" Brianna asked, her eyes wide with terror. The shadowman was getting closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They had no choice. "Help me," Caleb shouted, pulling at the chains with all his strength. With a sickening creak, one of the chains broke free, and the door began to open. As the massive iron door creaked open, an icy wind rushed out, carrying the scent of decay and something far worse, something ancient. The whispers around them grew louder, swirling into a chaotic chorus of voices, but they no longer seemed distant. Now they felt as though they were coming from deep within the room. Caleb and Brianna stepped back, staring into the abyss that the door revealed. Beyond the threshold was a narrow stone staircase leading down into darkness. Faint, red light flickered from below, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We have to go down there, don't we?" Brianna's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. Caleb nodded, his throat dry. "There's no other way out." The shadow man that had been advancing toward them seemed to hesitate as the door opened fully. It stood at the edge of the light, its form flickering like a broken image. The whispers around them seemed to pull it back, as if the entity itself feared whatever lay beyond the door. With no other options, Caleb led the way down the stone steps, his flashlight flickering in and out. Each step echoed like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something dreadful. The air grew thicker with each step, and the temperature dropped further. The red light grew brighter, flickering from an unknown source at the bottom of the stairs. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with old, cracked stone, and in the center of the room was an enormous pit. From the pit, the red light emanated, glowing like molten lava. Around the edges of the pit, symbols were carved into the ground, similar to the ones they'd seen upstairs. And then they saw the bodies. Piles of corpses, some decades old, others more recent, were stacked against the far wall. Their hollow eyes seemed to watch Caleb and Brianna, as if warning them of the horror that was about to unfold. "We need to leave now," Brianna muttered, her voice trembling. But as they turned to go back up the stairs, a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. The pit of glowing light pulsed, and something began to rise from it. A massive figure, its body made of shadows and molten rock, eyes burning with hatred. A demon. The ground shook violently, knocking Caleb and Brianna to the floor. The creature let out another roar, its voice a mixture of agony and rage. It climbed out of the pit, its claws scraping the stone floor, leaving molten trails behind. We can't fight that," Brianna stammered, her eyes locked on the monstrosity before them. Caleb scrambled to his feet, grabbing Brianna's arm. "We don't have to. We just have to run." But the demon was faster than they could have imagined. It swung one of its massive arms, smashing into the stone steps they had just descended, obliterating their only exit. Trapped, the demon towered over them, its molten eyes burning with fury. Its breath filled the air with the stench of sulfur and death. Caleb's heart raced as he desperately searched the room for anything that could help them escape. Then he saw it. On the far side of the chamber, behind the piles of bodies, was a set of ancient-looking runes carved into the wall. They glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the demon's movements. "That's it," Caleb muttered to himself. "That's the way to stop it." "What are you talking about?" Brianna's voice was strained with panic, her eyes darting between Caleb and the towering demon. "The runes," Caleb said, pointing toward the wall. "They're keeping it here. If we can destroy them, maybe we can trap it again." Brianna hesitated, glancing at the demon, which was now lumbering toward them, each step shaking the ground. "You think we'll have enough time?" "We have to try." Without another word, they both sprinted toward the runes, dodging debris as the demon let out a roar that rattled the walls. It swung one of its massive arms again, narrowly missing them as they ducked behind the piles of bodies. The heat from its attack singed the air, but they pressed on. Caleb reached the runes first, his fingers tracing the strange symbols. They pulsed with an unnatural energy, sending a chill through his body. He grabbed a large piece of rubble and raised it over his head. Before he could strike, the demon lunged forward, grabbing Brianna by the leg. She screamed as its molten grip began to burn through her skin. Caleb turned, his heart pounding. "Brianna!" She struggled, kicking at the demon's hand with her free leg, but its grip only tightened. Caleb didn't hesitate. With all his strength, he slammed the rubble into the runes. The wall cracked, and the runes dimmed slightly. The demon let out a screech of pain, releasing Brianna and stumbling backward. Its body flickered, as if it were losing form. Caleb swung again, and the runes shattered. A deafening sound filled the chamber as the demon's body began to disintegrate, its molten form turning to ash. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and cracks spread across the floor. The pit in the center of the room began to collapse, sucking the demon's remains back into the earth. Caleb grabbed Brianna's arm, pulling her away from the collapsing pit. They scrambled toward the far wall, dodging falling debris as the chamber continued to cave in. With one final roar, the demon was gone, dragged back into the pit from which it had come. The ground stopped shaking, and an eerie silence filled the air. They were alive, but barely. The Winchester Mystery House had almost claimed 2 more souls. Let's never do that again," Brianna gasped, clutching her burned leg. Caleb nodded, too exhausted to speak. As they limped back up the stairs, the whispers faded, leaving only the haunted silence of the house behind.